Just want to say hello to everyone. We're going to be starting in just 1 minute. Welcome. It's wonderful to see. We already have 100 people on, and we are going to start again in just a minute. And if you please just know that unfortunately we have to have everyone muted, but it's so good to see everyone's faces. We want to make sure we can see each other in community. And I am going to be handing it over in a second to the moderator tonight, Dana Sandweiss. And please check your chats for being able to ask questions or put in any information that you want to add to this evening's program. I'm going to mute myself now and let Dana Sandweiss begin.
Hello, welcome everyone to Access Missouri's program tonight. If you're not familiar with Access Missouri, we're a Missouri statewide political action committee inspired by Jewish values that provides education and support to state and local candidates and initiatives in Missouri that embrace and advocate for reproductive freedom and health care. It's a very sad and scary time right now, but it's also a great time to be together, because we need collective education and collective action to create an inclusive, accessible right to abortion in the United States. The elevation of the rights of the fetus above the rights of a pregnant person is counter to Jewish teachings. This is political, and Access Missouri is here to make a drastic change in Missouri politics by supporting elected officials that embrace reproductive health care. In fact, we have Access Missouri's first 2022 endorsed candidate, Representative Tracy McCreary, candidate for Missouri Senate District 24 on the Zoom with us tonight. Tracy's been a superstar for reproductive justice throughout her life, including in Missouri, in the Missouri House. And now, with all of your help, Tracy is on her way to represent us in the Senate. Tracy, are you here yet?
I am here.
Great. Would you like to introduce yourself before we start the program?
I would love to do that. Thank you for this opportunity. I truly appreciate being endorsed by Access Missouri. We've been out talking to voters in the new Senate district for several weeks, and this endorsement will be a huge help and propel us to victory, I truly believe. So I am a state representative right now. It's really good to see so many friends on the line this evening. I have been a volunteer in the reproductive rights movement since 1992, around the time when I first moved to St. Louis right out of college. Started out making phone calls to help get pro-choice candidates elected, and have been a clinic escort, worked for a pro-choice state senator for years, and now I'm a candidate myself. So it's really good to see so many people whose lives I've crossed paths with over the last several decades. I am running in Senator Jill Shoup's open state Senate seat. It is critical that we hold on to the seat this cycle. It's the only competitive state Senate race in the state this cycle, which means that on August 2nd, 16 of the 17 open seats are going to be decided in either a Democratic or a Republican primary. This seat in St. Louis County that runs from Maryland Heights down 270 to the Jefferson County line is the only competitive state Senate seat, meaning that it will be decided in the general election. So having your endorsement is critical, and I'm sure we'll talk later tonight about other things that we can do to make sure that we hold on to this seat and make sure we have as many pro-choice elected officials in the legislature as possible. So thanks for the opportunity tonight.
Thank you, Tracy, so much. We're so excited to work with your campaign from here on out and help you take that Senate seat. We also have some other elected officials and candidates and friends that work in the reproductive space with us here tonight. I'm not sure if anybody else is here. If you want to take a second to introduce yourself. Is anybody else in? Okay. It seems.
Hi, Dana. I'm here. I'm Luce. I'm with the ACLU of Missouri, the Executive Director of the ACLU of Missouri. Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Luce. Jill Shoup, outgoing senator from the 24th, and delighted that Tracy McCreary will be taking that seat with your help. Thank you, Jill. So glad you could join us tonight. I also want to thank all of wait, real quick, is there anybody else before I move on?
I would just, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kyle Kearns. I am a pro-choice candidate for state representative down in South County. And you know, the horrible news from Friday, but glad that I can be here and hopefully flip a district and make it pro-choice and make some good inroads.
Thank you, Kyle, so much. We'll be working with you hopefully soon.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, good evening. This is Cindy Burney out in St. Charles, running in District 105. Glad to be here tonight and ready to hear what I can do to help Access Mo and also win this seat so I can help you in Jeff City.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cindy, so much for being here and for all your work. Anyone else?
Good evening, everyone. This is Terry Wilson. I'm a candidate for St. Louis County Council in the 1st District, and currently I'm a Jennings City Councilman. And I'm glad to be here, and I'm in the fight. And we gotta get more pro-choice candidates in.
Fantastic. Terry, thank you so much for being here with us and for running for this office. Our local government is so important, as we learned, you know, during COVID. A lot of us realized how important your work is. So thank you. Okay, anybody else? Okay.
Say something very quickly, sorry. It came to our attention that we have a limit on our Zoom call. We are so sorry. If people who are on here, I know that Rabbi Rose just said that we had so many people sign up. So apologies. If people you are getting calls from are blocked out, we are going to send a recording to everyone who signed up and to everyone who is on our email list. We will probably have a link on our website as well. So again, apologies, and I want everyone to be able to continue and enjoy the hour event. We are an all-volunteer group, and so we are in need of administrative support, and we're doing the best we can by the seat of our pants. Okay, I'll let you continue, Dana. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. So before I introduce our main speaker tonight, Rabbi Susan Talvey of Central Reform Congregation and a reproductive rights leader in our community is going to deliver a Devar Torah, a teaching rooted in Jewish history tradition this evening. So Rabbi Talvey, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's an honor. I'm thrilled to be here, and I just love that we are going to do a text study tonight. It's just what we need, and no one better than Susan Appleton to guide us through what we need to know if we're going to move forward. The Torah always finds a way to guide us in the most challenging of times. This week, we meet Korach, the rebel who questions the authority of Moses with words that sound right. He says, "Aren't we all holy, Moses?" But we learn that the motivation of Korach is not so holy. He's just after power. He doesn't want to change the structures of power. He just wants more power for himself. His controversy, we learn, is not l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And we take this lesson through the wilderness to make sure that all of our controversies, our fights, our causes are all for the sake of heaven, which means they are for the common good and not self-interest. They are for the sake of the most vulnerable and not the elite few. And they make sure that we are not just tearing down, but that we are building up better systems that do not divide us by class and race and faith, but serve and include and protect us all. In America, religion has often been associated with an anti-abortion stance. But we know that an overwhelming majority of Americans working to protect the right to choose an abortion are doing so because of our religious commitments. My fight for choice is grounded in both Jewish law and in Jewish tradition's understanding of our profound commitment to protect the rights of the most vulnerable. Jewish tradition protects the rights and the life of a person who is pregnant and does not force pregnancy upon us. Abortion access then is a matter of religious freedom. Jews are not only permitted to terminate a pregnancy when our lives are at stake, we may be obligated by Jewish law to do so. Government intervention that would prevent the free exercise of protecting my life constitutes an infringement of First Amendment rights. And abortion laws that draw upon specific Christian concepts like fetal personhood, for example, or the notion that life begins at conception, do not allow for other understandings of when life begins. We call this the sin of certainty. It is the sin of certainty when we impose our personal beliefs that by definition can change upon others. We've been living in a post-Roe state for some time. The cruel suffering and deaths caused by limited access and funds for life-saving reproductive health care and abortions will only continue to grow. And this too is an affront to our highest principle, pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life. Those who limit access have blood on their hands. So the Torah gives us a path when our rights and our lives are threatened. First, we grieve. We hear the groaning that draws godliness into the story, and we gather and we grow the movements to right the wrongs. And then we learn. We spend time studying the texts that teach us where we've been, what the laws actually say, so that we may know how to respond effectively. And then we're Jews, and then we act, because we are far from done. This is far from over. And I have to believe that when we come out on the other side of this dark time, we will have reproductive freedom and affordable and safe and legal access to reproductive health care and contraception and abortion for absolutely all who seek it. And yes, it's a very Jewish thing to do, to know where we want to go. We had a glimpse of the promised land and we kept it in view, even in the darkest of times. This week's portion also guides us here. It ends with a radical restructuring of the community. Leaving Pharaoh, the great divider, behind wasn't easy, and it wasn't enough. We also had to come up with a new way of relating, a revolution that would truly make everyone see the holiness and infinite worth in each other and learn to make room for the and. Abortion bans deepen all of the structural inequalities in our society, and it is time for that revolution. And we have a path. Yesterday we grieved and we gathered. Tomorrow we will act to build a better, more just system. And tonight we will study the texts and learn exactly what we're up against in this moment, so that when we respond, it will be l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, and we will protect our right and our responsibility to choose.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Talvi, for those beautiful words and for being here with us tonight. Your presence is so needed and so welcome. I now want to introduce our guest speaker, who we are so fortunate to be able to hear from tonight. Susan Freilich Appleton, the Lemma Barkaloo and Phoebe Cousins professor at Washington University School of Law, focuses her scholarship and teaching on issues of family, sex, gender, reproduction, and feminist legal theory. Susan has won awards for both her teaching and publications. Outside law school, she's actively engaged with the American Law Institute, serving on its council, and she sits on the boards of the Guttmacher Institute and Planned Parenthood of the St. Louis region. Again, Susan, thank you so much for being here tonight. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this decision.
Thank you, Dana and Vicki, for inviting me and for organizing this event. And thank you, Rabbi Susan, for those important words. I have some slides to show, so I want to make sure that can everyone see them? Working okay? Great. Okay, well, I've given many talks on this case before, but this is the first since the Supreme Court issued its final opinions. And the news is every bit as dire as we feared. In fact, there's not much to decode. So when it says decoding Dobbs, there's actually nothing mysterious about it. Bottom line, a constitutional right to abortion no longer exists, and that allows government to control our pregnancies, our bodies, our personal choices, our destinies, and our place in society. I'm going to divide my time into three principal parts. First, I'm going to say a few words about the court's opinions, focusing principally on the majority opinion for 5 justices, but noting some of the separate opinions when relevant. Second, I'll provide a glimpse of developments in the state and on the ground. And then third, I'll identify what I think are some particularly thorny problems likely to arise post-Dobbs. So here, this is the cover of the case, and you can see the breakdown on the court. Justice Alito delivered the opinion in which 4 other justices joined. Thomas, who was one of those, and Kavanaugh, who was another, filed additional concurring opinions. Roberts did not join the main opinion, but he joined in the judgment and then filed a separate opinion. And then there's a dissent authored by Breyer and joined by Sotomayor and Kagan. And the formal issue was the constitutionality of Mississippi's 15-week ban on abortion, but the effect is to let states enact any abortion restrictions they want for just about any reason. What stood out for me first from the majority opinion by Justice Alito was the utter contempt for Roe versus Wade and the justices who participated in it. The opinion says that Roe was egregiously wrong from the start. It says that Roe was remarkably loose in its treatment of the constitutional text. It describes Roe's reasoning as extremely weak. It's more caricature than close reading. And we get a much more careful analysis of Roe and the later case affirming it, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, from the dissent by Justice Breyer et al. They explain each move that the court made in those past cases and the reason for those moves. Now, the core reason that the Constitution does not protect abortion, according to the majority, is that it is not grounded in constitutional text, and that those who wrote the 14th Amendment back in the 1800s could not have meant for the reference in the amendment to liberty to include abortion. And this is the 14th Amendment, and you can see its protection against deprivations of liberty without due process of law. The problem is that one could say the same thing about other rights that the court has recognized as part of liberty. So can the court eliminate one without having everything else collapsing? So early on, the court had recognized that liberty in the 14th Amendment includes the right to raise one's child as one sees fit, later to marry across racial lines, then to the right to use and have access to birth control. Those cases were followed by Roe, which recognized a limited right to terminate a pregnancy. Roe was cited as precedent for the right to engage in private sexual conduct outside marriage and regardless of gender in Lawrence versus Texas, and then finally Obergefell versus Hodges, which gave us nationwide marriage equality. The majority protests that abortion is unique in that it ends potential life. But the dissent says no, that the emphasis on history at the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment definitely puts many of these other rights in jeopardy. And Justice Thomas, in his separate concurring opinion, is ready to get right at it, explicitly inviting challenges to birth control and marriage equality as protected rights. Just as an aside, I commend the op-ed piece that's posted on the New York Times website by Michelle Goodwin, who makes a very strong case for why the 14th Amendment, which was an anti-slavery measure, does protect against forced pregnancy, which was part of slavery. So that's a great op-ed piece to take a look at. The court then gets into a lengthy engagement with the doctrine of stare decisis, the idea that because the issue has already been decided and reaffirmed in the past, that's a bar to revisiting the question. But the court says that doesn't apply here because Roe was egregiously wrong when it was decided. Now, when Roe announced a right to abortion, it located it in the 14th Amendment because it found a right to privacy there. And it's fair to say that such reasoning invited controversy, and later cases looked more directly at liberty rather than privacy as an aspect of liberty. Many noted that the idea of privacy did not really capture the intimate decision-making or autonomy that was at stake. And in addition, to say that abortion is private then makes it very hard to argue that the government has any constitutional obligation to support abortions for indigent people or others with difficulty obtaining access. And the result then of that privacy legacy has been the pernicious Hyde Amendment and similar state laws that deprive many of access to abortion care. Privacy also means, of course, that the government has no obligation under the Constitution to support those who would prefer to carry their pregnancies to term, if only they could afford to do so. Many, many people seek abortion because of poverty. And yet this notion that such decision-making must be private really shuts down claims for government support. So that possible weakness in Roe's privacy approach created an opening for an alternative rationale. And Rabbi Susan was talking about openings, and this would seem to be an opening for an alternative argument that has gained momentum over the years. And under this alternative rationale, abortion access is necessary for gender equality. That in addition to protecting liberty, the 14th Amendment requires equal protection of the laws. And sex or gender equality doctrine developed really only after Roe versus Wade was decided. And while it was never a predominant rationale, threads of the gender equality argument surfaced in later opinions, such as Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So with Roe's fate on the line, the gender equality argument for abortion rights was presented squarely and explicitly to the court in Dobbs. But the Alito majority rejected it in just 2 paragraphs. And this was so despite an excellent brief detailing and elaborating the argument and making 3 main points: that pregnancy-based regulations, including abortion restrictions, are sex-based regulations and therefore merit heightened review because they discriminate on the basis of sex. Second, that the state's justifications for abortion restrictions, claiming to protect women and fetal life, are inextricably intertwined with outdated stereotypes about women and their role in society. And anti-stereotyping has played a major role in the development of the Supreme Court's gender equality doctrine. And then finally, emphasizing the harm to women, especially Black women, posed by pregnancy and childbirth, and especially in a state like Mississippi with its very high maternal mortality rate. The gender equality brief noted how the state had rejected less discriminatory means to protect women and fetal life. So Mississippi could have provided better sex education, but it didn't. It could have provided better access to contraception. It could have offered paid family leave to more people. It could have had government-sponsored daycare. That all of those things would be better ways to protect women and fetal life. But that meant nothing to the Alito majority. Despite its willingness to overrule Roe, which had been reaffirmed many times, the court in Dobbs invoked a much criticized precedent from 1974 that held that pregnancy-based discrimination does not constitute sex discrimination because the category of non-pregnant people includes both males and females, or men and women.
God.
And that ruling was so controversial that one commentator wrote that criticizing it had become a cottage industry. Congress also objected, and to the extent it could, it modified Title VII, which disallows sex-based discrimination in employment, to say that pregnancy discrimination is sex discrimination. But that 1974 case was never overruled and now comes in handy for Alito and his colleagues. I think there's an interesting side note here because we have an ongoing contemporary conversation about whether to talk about pregnant women or pregnant people so that we can be more inclusive and add non-binary individuals and trans men to the conversation. And in some ways, what Alito did was sort of the mirror image of that and said that, well, it's not really a line based on sex. But my take is that the gender equality argument is the best argument for abortion rights, and it has a long history. According to the argument, and I will use gender terms, that even if we classify the fetus as a person, abortion bans single out pregnant women to be good Samaritans required to support the lives of such fetal persons, even at the risk of physical harm or even death to themselves. And no one else in our society has that obligation. It might be a great idea if I would donate a kidney to, say, my child, if my child needs one, but even as a parent, I do not have that obligation because it would pose some physical risk to me. I can't be required to donate part of my body to save the life of another human being. We could amplify the argument given today's intense focus on self-defense and the castle doctrine. Law has long allowed us to protect our brick and mortar homes from unwanted intruders, and we have all these stand your ground rules. So why shouldn't we be able to protect our flesh and blood homes as well, our bodies? One of my former students who is on this call sent me a message in the chat that in terms of Jewish law, we could see the fetus as a rodef, a pursuer whom one can attack in self-defense. And maybe our rabbis can elaborate on that later. But in any event, as the dissent points out in Dobbs, women's interests are completely invisible in the majority's analysis. And of course, women were not considered full citizens in 1868, the time of the 14th Amendment anyway. So with both liberty and equal protection rejected, the majority says that only the lowest standard of review applies. And that standard says the state can restrict abortion for any rational basis, including its interest in protecting potential life. So, for example, it becomes a mere policy issue for legislators to decide that caring to term and anonymously leaving a baby at a safe haven site adequately addresses the interest of the pregnant woman. This reasoning completely overlooks the real toll that pregnancy entails, as the dissent points out. And here's some maternal mortality rates in the United States. In the US, the maternal mortality rate is more than double that of most other high-income countries, and as much as 9 times higher than some, such as New Zealand and Norway. The number is increasing, and it bears emphasis that Black individuals are more than 3 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than their white counterparts, as data from Mississippi, the state in Dobbs, makes plain. So that's an analysis of what the court did, just a snapshot of it. Let me turn briefly now to some developments on the ground. So states have ramped up their anti-abortion activity in anticipation of Roe's demise. And we know what states will do. 26 states are certain to ban abortion, and they've already started the process. A number of service providers have been getting ready. For example, our local Planned Parenthood affiliate, where I've long served on the board, opened a satellite office across the Mississippi River in the more abortion-friendly state of Illinois a couple years ago, because we saw what was happening. And just a couple months ago was the ribbon cutting ceremony on the new regional logistics center, which was explicitly designed to help those from out of state. So abortion travel is something that's happening now. It's sure to increase now that constitutional protection has been eliminated. And this is a map that it's an interactive map when you see it live that will show you how many miles you have to travel from a state where abortion is banned in order to get access. But travel, of course, is not a satisfactory solution. It's expensive, it's inconvenient, it poses obstacles, and many people simply won't be able to do that. So this brings me now to the third part of my talk, and that is thorny post-Dobbs problems. So two flow from this fact of abortion travel. Abortion is interstate commerce, and therefore Congress has the authority to regulate it if it wants to. So one question is whether Congress could enact a federal ban. If Congress did so, that would rest on the same authority as the unsuccessful Women's Health Protection Act, which many of us were rooting for, that would have codified Roe versus Wade, but the US Senate rejected. Another issue stemming from abortion travel is whether restrictive states can reach out beyond their borders to take aim at abortions that their residents obtain elsewhere. And this issue has been in the news with Missouri prominently featured, and the Dobbs dissent raises the issue here. So at the same time that states like Missouri are thinking about trying to project their laws outside their borders, more hospitable states are seeking to become abortion havens, and they've begun to legislate protections for abortions and providers in their states. We've had action along those lines in California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Michigan, and New York. But at best, these are just first steps or partial measures. And I think the really important fact to note is that no state can fully eliminate risks for providers, because the dominant approach to whose law applies in a multi-state case these days is not strictly territorial. And it recognizes that states can have policies that apply to their residents, even when their residents are out of state. So if a hostile state gets jurisdiction over an abortion participant and the case is litigated in the hostile state is probably free to apply its own law. It just has to have significant contacts with the case giving rise to state interests. Efforts to regulate extraterritorially could take various forms. They could take the form of civil causes of action for damages, like Texas's notorious SB 8. The bounty hunter law, some have wondered whether out-of-state conduct that helps Texans obtain abortions is actionable. Probably not, because Texas has a presumption against extraterritoriality, and there's no explicit statutory language here to overcome that. But copycat legislation has been introduced in several other states that may not have that kind of presumption. Criminal laws are another possibility, although they would be rare. The Model Penal Code, which has influenced many states in enacting their criminal codes, does recognize that a state can apply its law to conduct in another state when the conduct bears a reasonable relation to a legitimate interest of this state, and the actor knows or should know that his conduct is likely to affect that interest. In addition, criminal laws could take aim at providing aid in state X, say Missouri, to help a Missouri resident terminate a pregnancy in, say, Illinois. By way of analogy, several states have laws that make it a crime locally to promote travel for purposes of prostitution. Missouri has long had on its books a civil measure regarding minors in response to the fact that minors were getting help going to Illinois to terminate their pregnancies. This is a civil cause of action, but we could imagine a criminal counterpart. Really difficult constitutional questions are posed by at least some of these efforts to regulate beyond a state's borders. And most of these questions are completely unsettled, because in most cases, states don't bother with what's happening outside their boundaries. But this might be the first time. So we could think about challenges under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, Article 4's Full Faith and Credit Clause. I'm just going to scroll through these because we'd really have to get into the weeds to analyze any of them, but I could talk about them in questions if someone wants. The Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4, the Vicinage Clause, which applies to criminal cases and comes from the 6th Amendment. If abortion counseling about opportunities in other states is targeted, maybe there's a First Amendment freedom of speech argument. There's a right to travel implied in the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, and Justice Kavanaugh in his separate concurrence references that and says, well, of course, people can travel in order to get abortions if they need to. And then there's the Commerce Clause. The Dormant Commerce Clause is a doctrine because abortion is interstate commerce, as I've noted. So some authorities say that if a state law criminalizing out-of-state conduct aimed at the abortion provider, that would violate the Commerce Clause, but other authorities say it would be fine to aim a law to the patient who travels to go out of state. So, but all of this is yet to be settled, and we don't know how it will come out. Now, I mentioned that under the Commerce Clause, it might be okay to prosecute the traveling patient, and it's worth noting that historically abortion laws have always punished the provider, not the patient. And that's because the gender discrimination that underlies abortion restrictions is so profound that such laws can't even recognize the patient's agency. And she's not considered an actor or an accomplice, because the purpose of the statutes, I would say, is to control women and to deny her agency. Even the draconian Texas law exempts the patient. And apparently so does our Attorney General Eric Schmidt's recent opinion letter. When it quotes the law that now will go into effect, you can notice that it's aimed at the person who's performing or inducing the abortion upon a woman. But notice that the last sentence, a woman upon whom an abortion is performed or induced shall not be prosecuted for a conspiracy to violate the provisions of this subsection. I think that means, therefore, she can't be prosecuted for the crime itself. However, with the rise of self-managed medication abortion, there's no identifiable provider to punish, and we could see a change in the way abortion laws are structured so that they no longer exempt the patient from liability. But in any event, these extraterritorial issues are unresolved constitutional issues in any context, and we may not find out the answer until it comes up in the abortion context, which is going to bring a lot of baggage with it and probably determine the answer. Now, this reference that I made to the patient's possible complicity is a second thorny post-Dobbs problem. Medication abortions have increased, so self-managed abortion care will become more widespread, and medication will be obtained by the mail or from outside the United States. You can see the rise in medication abortions. So what will that mean in terms of regulation, and more specifically, the target of punitive measures? You might remember from the 2016 presidential campaign that Donald Trump famously said that there must be punishment for the abortion patient herself, but he was forced to walk that back because he failed to follow the party line that abortion restrictions are designed to help and protect women, not punish them. In other countries where the woman ending the pregnancy can be prosecuted, data show that the impact falls on poor and minority individuals who present at hospitals when follow-up care is necessary, and the hospital then must report them. Their more privileged counterparts see private physicians and escape such reporting. So we'll need to wait and see what the rise of self-managed abortion care will mean in this country, but already we're starting to see some ominous signs. The New York Times reported last month that there's a bill in Louisiana that would classify abortion as a homicide and would mean that women who end a pregnancy could be prosecuted. On the brighter side, some think that the FDA's authority over drugs could be used as a toehold for a friendly administration's protection and facilitation of medication abortion. And we're waiting word from President Biden along those lines. But that also means the tables could turn with an unfriendly executive branch. The third problem is, how far will states or Congress go? Suppose Congress legislates fetal personhood. Trigger laws, depending on phrasing, could apply to certain forms of contraception, such as IUDs or LARCs or Plan B. Missouri has had a statute on the books since the 80s that says that the life of each human being begins at conception. What does conception mean? Is that fertilization? Is that most definitions of pregnancy require implantation? Some forms of birth control prevent implantation of fertilized eggs. So there's a question about exactly what some of this language will mean, not for abortion, but for birth control. Best practices for miscarriage care will become problematic and possibly criminal. And although the Supreme Court has never constitutionalized assisted reproduction like in vitro fertilization, overruling Roe could have dire implications for processes that require the creation, manipulation, and destruction of human embryos, even if it's in an effort to create a pregnancy rather than to end one. And then finally, what happens to gender equality more generally? What restrictions might be imposed on those who are pregnant or who might become pregnant in an effort to protect their future offspring? Will we see the pregnancy police telling us what jobs we can take or what kinds of risks we're allowed to take? So on that somewhat pessimistic note, I will end and pass the microphone back to Dana.
A lot to think about, a lot of openings. And we have a lot of questions. So as I have my own questions, but I want to take some questions from the chat. So Holly, do you want me to do this? Let's see.
Do you want to do it or do you want me to?
You can if you've been watching it. That would be great.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Appleton, for your presentation. We had a number of questions, some of which were submitted even in advance of the talk. And the first one was from Rabbi Goldstein, who asked to please talk about the difference between Plan B and the abortion pill, and the fate of both those pills in Missouri, and thoughts on whether or not Missouri residents will be able to access those pills through the mail from other places.
So the first part of the question is I guess I would say is a medical question, but I would say that Plan B takes effect before implantation. If fertilization might have occurred, then it won't implant. So it's a post-fertilization method of birth control. On the other hand, the abortion pill terminates a pregnancy, an early pregnancy, I think roughly 10 weeks, but I might not have the most up-to-date range of time there. And so there, a pregnancy has started, the embryo has implanted, but Plan B changes the chemistry of the womb and it's expelled. And so those are different. And so the question really goes to what I was suggesting at the end. When Missouri says, for example, that life begins at conception, what does it mean by conception? Does it mean fertilization? Does it mean implantation? There are other forms of birth control. And many say that the ordinary birth control pills also work frequently to prevent implantation rather than to prevent fertilization.
I
Those
do
are important questions.
Yeah, I do want to mention that currently the abortion pill you cannot get in Missouri because abortion is illegal in Missouri. Plan B you can still get. That's to stop a pregnancy. It actually doesn't end a pregnancy. I am curious, from the legislative standpoint, have you, I know Representative McCreary is on here and Senator Schuh. Can you speak to, has there been talk in the legislature about maybe banning the contraception?
Well, I will tell you that even a year ago, with the federal reimbursement allowance bill that draws down federal dollars for us to pay for our Medicaid patients, there was an amendment attached to that bill that we were able to defeat, but it would essentially have outlawed access to birth. It would have outlawed birth control in the state of Missouri for low-income patients who utilize Medicaid. So yes, I would not be surprised at all if the legislature moved in that direction. I'm sorry to say.
No, thank you.
We had another question in the chat that I was super curious about too, which are what are the implications in Missouri to the treatment of things like ectopic pregnancy and miscarriage, and I would add cancer, because, right, I think the current law in Missouri says that you can only have an abortion if the mother's life is in immediate danger, but I may not be quoting that quite correctly.
Yes, and I don't have the exact language in front of me either, but I have been hearing horror stories from a variety of states and other countries where, because of the need to show that life is in danger, treatment is postponed until the situation gets very, very close to death. When everybody knows that earlier intervention would be better, and that there's no possible way that the pregnancy can have a good outcome anyway. And I was just hearing several stories along those lines on the radio today, and there's a story in the New York Times as well about an American woman who found herself in Malta at a time that she miscarried but couldn't get treatment because there was continued to be a fetal heartbeat. Even though, and another story about a woman whose water broke, but there was a grave risk. She was at grave risk of infection, but couldn't be treated right away and was told to get on an airplane and fly to another state that allowed intervention earlier.
And Dana, I wanted to add, because I've looked at the trigger law and the exceptions to the trigger law, and it does purport to have like a narrow exception for medical emergencies, but that is really a farce because it instantly makes providing abortion care a felony. And really, from a civil rights and liberties perspective, it turns the presumption of innocence upside down, forcing the medical provider to prove that they are innocent because it was an emergency. And even in emergencies, it's truly fanciful to think or pretend that a healthcare professional will accept being charged with a felony on the hope that they can prove their innocence at trial because it was an emergency. So it's incredibly problematic. And this whole promise of this exception for medical emergencies is meaningless because they also make providing abortion services grounds for revocation for the provider's medical license. So, you know, I'm married to a physician, and I can tell you it is instilling fear, knowing for any physician, knowing full well that they will have to defend their license for providing an abortion, and they will invite felony charges, and you can't defend on the basis of an emergency of the abortion without admitting to having done an abortion and providing abortion care. And that opens you up to felony charges for an ideologically driven prosecutor.
And I think we've seen this phenomenon more widely. For example, when Texas's SB 8 first went into effect, even though there were serious legal questions about its validity, it really did stop the practice of abortion in Texas because providers are risk averse, and it's too dangerous to proceed in the face of that kind of uncertainty. So even if it's possible that the exception would apply, it's not entirely certain. And that means doctors won't take the risk in many cases. I don't want to say that about everyone.
So I think for our next question, I'm going to kind of bundle a couple questions together, which is that, right, everyone wants to know what can we do? Like, where are the holes? What are our way forward? I mean, you alluded to this before, but right, we had a couple of comments in the chat. Could we file a Supreme Court case that if a child's DNA can determine paternity, then the father has to be financially responsible? We had another person ask, can Jews appeal any criminal action based on religious freedom? Overlooking the hypocrisy of that the court is very fond of other religious freedom, but maybe not ours.
So actually,
like to know what they can do.
The religious question is interesting. There is a lawsuit that was filed in Florida by a synagogue, which claimed that Florida's restrictive law violated Jewish law, and hoping to have the religious freedom that this Supreme Court has elevated so much apply in this case. I don't know what will happen. I'm not optimistic, but that's a possibility. When there was a reference to fathers paying support, supposedly that's already on the books. It was not true at the time of Roe versus Wade. Unmarried fathers were not considered fathers at all in some states. But today, the push to keep dependency private means that the state and the federal government try to go after anyone in the private family who could provide support. It's not always successful. Often poverty means that there just isn't the money there. But at least according to the law on the books, fathers do have financial responsibilities until the child reaches the age of majority. Sometimes the mother doesn't want to pursue that, and then there are questions of whether the state can make her do so. In terms of what you can do, I'd say vote, campaign for legislators who are going to support reproductive justice, or consider running for office yourself.
Great. And Luce, is there something from the ACLU and from your perspective you can add to this? Also, and can you tell us a little bit of the ballot initiative work? I know that's going on. That's another, what can we do?
Yes, that's a great addition.
Yeah, so I will say across the country, we are really looking at our state constitutions to see where is it in our state constitutions that we can point to that more explicitly protects the right to an abortion. There is some litigation planned across the country based on state constitutional rights. I will also emphasize that in Michigan and Vermont, there are ballot initiatives to amend the state constitutions to explicitly enshrine the right to an abortion in those constitutions. On the opposite side, in Kentucky and Kansas, there is a defensive ballot measure where the opposition has sought to try to enshrine in the Constitution, in their state constitutions, to emphasize that there is no right to an abortion. And so there is some defensive work around that and looking at how can we flip that on its head to make it an affirmative right to an abortion. So really the battle will be on the states. And like Susan says, voting is important. We have to vote like our rights depend on it, because they do. And the reality is, we know across the country and in Missouri, the majority of folks, we know this because of polling, do not support an all-right ban to an abortion, which is what we have in Missouri. So we really need to support our grassroots organizations who are bringing together folks, and we really need to support the entities who are supporting abortion in other states to hold the line while we figure out what's happening in Missouri. We're looking currently at what's happening across the country and in our sister state in Kansas with that ballot initiative, that defensive ballot initiative that is, it's going to be up for a vote in August to see how that will inform what we do here in Missouri. So that's sort of where we are. There is hope. The fight is not over. We will continue to fight in the state legislatures, in the courts, on ballot initiatives, and across different elections. There is power in the people. And we know that the majority of the people do not support what is happening right now. So we need to make sure that we connect those people and activate those people to really make sure that we have elected officials who represent our values and our interests.
And did you have something to add to the religious freedom argument? I wasn't sure.
So that is something that is actively being explored. It is, again, like all of this, and Professor Appleton has mentioned, all of this, these are all issues of first impression in this context. So I'm very curious. That is something we're actively also looking into and exploring as a possibility.
Yeah, I would say there are some other states that are trying to enshrine abortion in the Constitution of the state, and that it's also interesting that many conservative judges who don't want to see matters recognized as federal constitutional rights do seem to have greater respect for state constitutional rights. And so state constitutions are emerging as important vehicles for protecting rights. So that might be an opening that, for Rabbi Talvi to focus on.
We have another question in the chat, just along the lines of the what can we do, of where is the best place to donate money to help the cause. That may be more a question for Dana.
Right. Well, and we are going to send a follow-up email to this program tonight with links and information on a lot of the organizations in Missouri, like Lou said, that are on the ground doing the work. And as you see, Tracy McCrary, we have some great candidates on this call. So they need help. They need money. They need help and resources. So please reach out to candidates. We have several on this call, Cindy Burney as well. We're great resources. We're endorsing, look at Planned Parenthood's endorsed candidates, Pro-Choice Missouri, and support those candidates. So do we have?
And us.
Oh, and Access Missouri, of course. Absolutely. Holly, are there any other questions?
There are a few other questions. I wasn't sure if we had time for them.
Time for one more question.
So we had a question. Akil Amar said that you can be pro-choice and anti-Roe. How could he say that?
I don't know exactly why he said that, but my speculation would be that, as I mentioned, there was lots of criticism of the right to privacy analysis, and that you could support abortion freedom and reproductive justice based on equality principles instead of liberty principles. And I should say that when this decision came out on Friday, I happened to be at a board meeting at the Guttmacher Institute. So I was with community who were all very concerned, and actually this is a big part of their professional lives. But there was definitely a feeling that that this is not an isolated problem, that what we're seeing in the abortion context is related to what we're seeing in the voting rights context, and it's what we're seeing in terms of not allowing Medicaid in some states, and that it's all of a piece of trying to subordinate a group of people, particularly Black women.
Lou said that there was hope, and I'm wondering, where is the hope? What is any light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, even a pinpoint?
Well, I would say that the idea of the state constitutional amendment is worth pursuing. I think trying to mitigate some of the harm that these laws would inflict. Even if you can't stop abortion from being illegal in Missouri, can you stop Missouri from targeting providers and patients in Illinois? So yes, we're in a position of a huge loss, but how can we mitigate that loss?
And protect pregnant people in Missouri, healthcare, providing, maybe the state will provide services and we'll work with the state in the meantime while we fight this. To me, Karen, it's exactly what Lou said. We have to show up. We have to, it might not be overnight, but we're not going to give up, and we need to change the way our Missouri, specifically our legislature, is the leadership in the legislature, and elect more pro-reproductive healthcare candidates and continue to challenge these in the courts of law. So.
And I will add, this did not happen overnight. We have been preparing for this moment for a long time because the opposition has been moving towards this for decades, pretty much since Roe was decided. And I will just share what I think, and this coming from an attorney, and I believe in our court system, and it's a really hard time for me right now, given what's happening. But I know that civil rights and liberties cannot and will not ever be forever won in our courts. They're truly won when we change hearts and minds, when we organize, and when we link arms in solidarity across movements, across identities and communities. And this is truly an opportunity to do that.
All right, we are coming up again the hour. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Professor Appleton, this was I learned so much. Thank you for your insights, and for everyone that spoke tonight, and for everyone that is with us. We are going to send a recording of this and links to different organizations that you can reach out to and help. And again, don't give up hope. We can do this. We just need to stay vigilant and continue to fight.
This was absolutely excellent. I can't thank everybody enough, and especially you, Dana, for putting this whole thing together, and Susan for being available. This was excellent.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you. Take care.